All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our second lecture. We are going to go ahead and look at what energy is, why we need energy as living organisms, and something called ATP that you probably have never heard of before. So let's go ahead and get started.
So, first off, let's look at the idea that we know every single living organism needs energy. And let's look at why do we need energy? Okay, we need energy to do different work. If we think about all the different chemical reactions, think about the chemistry chapter that we talked about, and all those different reactions, a lot of them require energy in order to occur. Think about all of the transportation that we talked about in the cell chapter, and how we said that sometimes there's active transport and how we need to move things through the cell using energy. Okay, those are chemical activities. In order for us to grow, how we went from a really cute little itty bitty baby into the sizes that we are now, and you're going to only continue to grow even more as you go through your teenage years and early adult years. Movement. Okay, in order for us to move, in order for us to have our organs working, for our heart to beat, for our eyes to blink, every little movement we make requires energy. Okay, reproduction requires a lot of energy. Repair requires a lot of energy. If you've ever broken a bone before, okay, or pulled or torn a muscle, that all requires repair. Even something as simple as a paper cut requires repair, and that involves energy being used. Okay, even when we're sleeping, there's a lot of energy being used and a lot of repair occurring. So energy is needed all the time by living organisms, and we're going to go ahead and look at what that energy is and what the source is. Now, when we look at energy, a lot of times energy changes its forms. So there's never new energy made or energy lost. It just changes the way that we see it. It just changes its form. So a lot of times chemical energy is stored inside of a chemical bond. Okay, and what we mean by that is inside of a chemical bond such as methane. Okay, carbon and 4 hydrogens bonded together, there might be a lot of stored energy in there. And the way that we get that energy is we can go ahead and break the bond apart, and we can also form new bonds. And a lot of times in that breaking and forming of bonds, we're going to see the release of energy that can then be used for the cells, or we can see the storage of energy where we can then go ahead and use it for later purposes when our cells need it. So we're going to talk a lot about chemical bonds breaking and releasing energy, and then chemical bonds being made and storing energy. Now, when we look at what energy is, okay, there is a molecule called ATP, and that stands for adenosine triphosphate, and that really is what we represent as chemical energy. So whenever we talk about energy in this chapter and in the next chapter, we're talking about ATP. ATP is our molecule of energy. Now, obviously, we can see where the A comes from, the T, and the P. Okay, when we look at the structure of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, the first part is that it has what's called an adenine to it. Okay, so this is that first part of ATP. Okay, adenine is a nitrogen group, and that's just the first component of making ATP. Now, the next part where we get the ending of adenosine comes from ribose. Okay, ribose is a sugar, so that is this part here. Okay, that's the second part of ATP. And the third part, the triphosphate. Okay, if you think about the prefix tri always means 3. Okay, if you have a tricycle, it has 3 wheels. So triphosphate means that there are 3 phosphate groups, 1, 2, 3, attached at the end of ATP. Okay, ATP has a lot of stored energy, lots and lots of stored energy. And we're going to go ahead and look at how we can go ahead and release that stored energy for our cell to actually be able to do some of the different jobs that it needs energy for. Okay, but ATP is that big stored energy molecule. It has 3 phosphates to it, and the other 2 components are the adenine and the ribose group. Now, what we need ATP for? Okay, again, it is our energy molecule. It supplies our muscles, it supplies all of our cells. Everything we need energy for is going to be in the form of ATP. Now, something really important to remember, and we're going to talk about also on the next slide, is when we look at the structure of ATP, if this is our 3 phosphates, okay, between the second and third phosphate, where those 2 phosphates are kind of glued and bonded together, there is a huge amount of stored energy here. Okay, there's lots and lots of stored energy between that second and third phosphate here. Okay, and that's going to be key with what we talk about on the next slide. Now, how we get energy from ATP, because again, so far all I've said is that ATP has a lot of stored energy. So the way that we get that energy that's being stored in that molecule is that we're going to break apart that high energy bond between the second and third phosphate. Okay, so what happens is we're going to remove that last third phosphate, and when that last third phosphate gets broken off, it releases tons of energy that then the cell can use to do the different jobs it needs to do. Now, when ATP breaks off that third phosphate, it becomes ADP, and that D stands for now diphosphate. Okay, the prefix di is 2. So because ATP lost its triphosphate, it now becomes ADP. And because when we drop off that third phosphate from ATP and we release a bunch of the energy for the cell to use, ADP has a much lower amount of energy. Okay, it's kind of like the kind of empty battery after it's been used. The nice thing is we can then go ahead and convert ADP back into ATP again. Okay, and we'll talk about that later throughout the chapter, but we can always go ahead and make more ATP. So if we look at the diagram below, okay, ATP has 3 phosphates. Okay, in that bond here, there's a lot of stored energy, tons and tons of it. And what we can do is, in order to use that energy that's stored right now, is we can go ahead and break that bond and drop off that third phosphate. When we break that bond there, all of that stored energy gets released for the cell to use. And now what we end up with is we end up with ADP. Okay, ADP now only has 2 phosphates, and this is that third phosphate that got broken off. Okay, it's all by itself. So that is now a lower energy molecule because it's released all the energy that was once stored in ATP in that third bond of that phosphate. That energy that was released, again, can be used by the cell to go ahead and do all the different jobs it needs to do. So ATP is like that fully charged battery. It has all that stored energy. And then once ATP drops off that third phosphate, releases that stored energy, and it becomes ADP, it's kind of that lower energy, partially charged battery. Okay. Now, our cells can go ahead and take ADP and make it ATP again by adding on another phosphate. And we'll look at ways that that can happen throughout the next 2 chapters. Now, using chemical energy, what we need cells to use ATP for, move materials into and out of the cell. Okay, think about active transport, what we talked about in our cell chapter, how we need to move things against the cell membrane, and we need some energy sometimes to do that. How to go ahead and help our proteins and muscles flex. Every time we move, our muscles are flexing. In order to do that, that requires ATP. It requires energy. Okay, any type of cells that move, such as a sperm cell, okay, or an immune system cell attacking something, that requires a lot of ATP. So a lot of ATP is needed for our cells to do all the different jobs that they are required to do and specialized to do. Now, there's a difference between ATP, which is going to be used up really, really quickly. ATP is used very rapidly. So what we do is we store energy in a molecule called glucose. Okay, glucose is C6H12O6. Okay, and it's a carbohydrate. So if you remember, In our chemistry unit, when we talked about carbs and proteins and lipids and nucleic acids, we said that carbohydrates are the main source of energy for us. And this is that case right now. So glucose has more than 90 times the amount of ATP and energy compared to what just one molecule of ATP can go ahead and give a cell. So a lot of times we go ahead and we store glucose, and then when we need ATP, we're going to break that glucose down in a process called cellular respiration. Okay, cellular respiration is going to break that glucose down into ATP for our cells to immediately use. And cellular respiration is going to be the last chapter of this semester that we go ahead and look at how we take that stored glucose that we've taken in through carbohydrates and through food, and how as animals we break that down into ATP to use it for energy. Okay, but glucose has way more actual usable energy stored within its bonds compared to just one molecule of ATP.